Hello, this is Robin Dennison. I've broken the content for this webinar into two parts. This is part one, which is going to focus on general principles of test construction. And then avoiding common errors is the second part of this particular module. So we're going to focus first on general principles of test construction. The first thing I'd like to do is to make sure that we give credit to three individuals who produced a lot of the content in this particular PowerPoint and webcast. And so there are two individuals from the Georgetown University Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, and then also the previous director of the Nurse Educator Program at Georgetown, who developed a lot of this content. Objectives first, as always, and we're going to talk about developing multiple choice items for appropriate difficulty and discrimination, differentiate between questions of various cognitive levels using Bloom's, and then also discuss guidelines for writing multiple choice items. Keep in mind that your reading assignments in McDonald also focus on short answer and matching and true-false items. So what is the purpose of a test? A test is to differentiate between students of differing knowledge ability levels. So as we look at each individual item, it's to differentiate between students who do know and students who don't know that particular content. And so we really want questions that look at various levels of knowledge when we talk about the cognitive domain, of course. What we do want too is congruence between the objectives and the activities, learning activities, and the evaluation. So I know I said it in the last, trying to remember which module that was, module 10, that exams must test objectives. So we start with objectives, and then we look at teaching learning activities, and then we also look at, of course, how do we evaluate the achievement of those objectives. So tests or exams must test objectives, and students should be able to look at the list of objectives and be able to review and know whether or not they're really prepared for the exam. I know that I've so often had students ask me for a study guide, and a study guide is your list of objectives. The list of objectives should clearly identify for that student whether or not they're ready or they're not ready for that exam, because the test must arise from the objectives. Next point is about test blueprints, and I know you've done quite a bit of reading about test blueprints. And the test blueprint really does produce a foundation for establishing validity evidence that a test really does represent the content of the course, the content of the module, and that it is really based on objectives. And it guides the systematic selection of a representative sample of the content and the objectives of a course. And that is, you certainly can't have a test that tests every single concept or principle of a module or of a course. So what you're looking for is a representative sampling of that content. And it certainly should focus on the most important content, right? Not trivia. So what are you testing? Some core principles to keep in mind are to decide exactly what it is you want to test. And I think that for some of us, we kind of look at the content and say, this is an absolute need to know. This is a nice to know. And this is a sometimes not even necessary to know, right? So you should be focusing on that absolute need to know content. Eliminate as many ambiguities as possible. And even though we want distractors that are certainly plausible, we really don't want tests where we have to spend a lot of time debating and arguing with students about what was the right answer. And then also you need to remember that this is a summative evaluation, and the intent is not to teach, but to evaluate. However, there is an opportunity to provide information and reinforcing information through feedback. And we can do this quite easily with electronic testing, but we can also do it with our test reviews that are done in person, so that when students ask, well, why is that the right answer, that you can give appropriate feedback as to why that distractor is not the right answer and why the right answer is the right answer. Some technical flaws to consider. First of all, issues that relate to irrelevant difficulty. You don't want stems that are tricky or unnecessarily complicated. You don't want options that are very long and complicated and doubled. You don't want options that are in a non-logical order. You know, sometimes if it's not the content itself, sometimes you like to kind of have the shortest answer and then next longest, next longest, next longest. There are ways to order your options so that, again, you don't give the student clues as to what is the right answer. What you don't want is to find out who's test savvy instead of who really knows the information. Numerical data that's not stated consistently. Anytime you use numerical data, you must identify the unit of measurement. So if you're talking about blood pressures and you say 120/80, you may think, well, 120/80 is adequate. Of course they know that's millimeters of mercury. Not enough. And that is, anytime you write a number, you should have a unit of measurement. That's in professional papers, that's in tests. There should always be a unit of measurement. Also, the terms in the options should be quite clear and not vague. And the language in the options should be parallel. And that is, they should be written in the same format. So if one's a fragment, they should all be fragments. If they're all complete sentences, they should all be complete sentences. If one starts with a verb, they should all start with a verb, and so on. The item shape. Remember, when you're writing questions, that the longest portion of a question should certainly be the stem. So you want a long stem and short options, not a short stem and long options. Let's talk about some general guidelines. First of all, the bulk of the question should be in the stem and not in the options. And you should avoid any superfluous information. You really want everything to be quite succinct. You don't want students wasting time reading it. Some of your students may run out of time if they have a lot of reading to do in the question. And then the other thing is that it contributes to mental fatigue. So avoid superfluous information. Also avoid tricky or overly complex items. Again, the goal is not to trick any student. This is to differentiate between who does know and who doesn't know. Write grammatically consistent options. Avoid absolutes like always, never, all. And then also avoid negatively stated questions. We'll talk some more about that later, but it has been very common in the past to write except questions, and that is the last word in the stem is except, which is a negatively stated question. And NCLEX no longer uses negatively stated questions, which means that you should not be using negatively stated questions. Most important is focus on important concepts and not waste time testing trivial facts. Again, focus on what is really important and test what's really important. So when writing options, remember that these are called distractors. You have the key or the right answer, and then you have distractors. And the distractors should look very similar to each other and should look very similar to the key. They should be homogeneous. The distractor should be clearly incorrect or at least inferior to the correct answer. Remember that there may be more than one correct answer, but there is a best answer. And so when you're writing questions where you have, yeah, that's right, but it's not the best option, those are questions that tend to have higher discrimination. The distractor should be plausible and very attractive to the uninformed. It should be very similar to the correct answer in construction, and it also should be grammatically consistent and logically compatible with the stem. You know, in the past, clues were things like, you know, if they had an A at the end of the stem, and then I knew that the correct answer had to start with a consonant. Obviously, we're a lot better about that these days than we used to be. But again, make sure that your grammar flows. Next point, some guidelines to keep your exams free of language that can be offensive or introduce bias. And this actually came directly from McDonald, but I thought it was so excellent that I thought we should talk about it in here. If you don't need to identify your patient in the question by gender or by name, then don't. Just identify them as the patient or the client. Refrain from stereotyping members of a group, where you identify, well, this patient in the case is Hispanic, and all Hispanics, da 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 da, all Caucasians, da 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 da. And of course, we know that's not true, and we don't want to perpetuate those kind of stereotypes. Avoid humor. Testing is not a place to show your sense of humor. If you have questions where people are starting to laugh when they read options, then you know that you have a problem. Avoid using references to race, culture, religion, marital status, sexual orientation, unless it relates specifically to the question. Avoid terminology that relates to popular culture. One thing is it really does date the question to a great degree, and it may confuse people who don't necessarily or aren't familiar with that particular pop culture aspect. If you related it to some particular TV show and someone in your class had no idea what that was. So don't put anything in there that's unrelated to the health issues. Eliminate vocabulary that has different or unfamiliar meaning to people of different ethnic or cultural groups. So some rules now on how to get better item discrimination, because that's what we really want. We want items that differentiate between who does know and who does not know. So first point there is to write items that assess nursing, right? That's what this test is about. All tests are about in nursing school, is about the profession and the practice of nursing. Also, you need to make sure that your item only tests one principle or concept. It is a big temptation to some people to incorporate multiple concepts in one test item, and you definitely don't want to do that. I'm reminded of the old ACLS exams where they would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phrases, statements. And then option A would be 1, 3, and 5. And option B would be all but 4, and so on. And those are terrible questions. We frequently refer to those as multiple multiples. Do not write items that assess reading comprehension or reading skills. That's not the purpose of the exam. And then also make sure that they are technically sound. You certainly want to make sure that the principles in the test item are consistent with current practice and current terminology, technology, terminology, etc. Next point is just some points about how to lose item discrimination, and these are certainly things that you don't want to do because you don't want to lose that item discrimination. So writing items that accidentally or deliberately attempt to assess multiple items or multiple aspects in one particular question, don't do it. Write items that high ability students often get wrong, and that can happen depending on how it's stated. And sometimes high ability students have a tendency to read into simple questions, right? And so sometimes it's a simple question, you think everybody will get this right, which is not a goal, but everybody will get this right. And then the students who did in general better on the exam did more poorly on that particular item. And you'll be talking more about point by serials and item discrimination later on. Writing items that low ability nursing students get right, then that again loses discrimination. And then writing items that are too easy or too hard. Obviously, if no one gets it right, or if everybody gets it right, it's equally useless. Some other points about item difficulty. How hard should an item be? Well, no fewer than 30% of your students should get the item correct, and no more than 90 of them should get the item correct. So what you'd like is somewhere between 30 and 90%, or ideally that sweet spot of about 50 to 70% of the students get the item correct. That's perfect. So in terms of item difficulty, why 30 to 90%? At least 30% correct, it seems unlikely that the item is, if less than 30% of the students get it right, it's likely to be not at a student level or to be very highly specialized, which is not what we typically test in undergraduate students. At more than 90% correct, it's too easy, and it really doesn't, again, contribute to discrimination when everybody gets it right. So 50% seems to be that point where the item has the most potential to spread the test items out. And so we'd like for them to be in that range. Next point about item difficulty is, should we try to have some really easy items so that the poor students don't get discouraged? You need to remember why you're testing. You're testing to differentiate between students who know and students who don't know. You're not testing to build self-esteem. This always reminds me of the concept that everybody got a trophy. If everybody gets a trophy isn't worth having, right? So if everybody gets an A, then it really doesn't tell you what you need to know about the knowledge level of those students. We need discrimination. And you know what I'll say many times is that you have to be thinking downstream. You have to be thinking about the students' future patients when they're a graduate. I know some nursing faculty think about, gee, would you want this student taking care of your mother? The issue is really, is this student safe to practice? Can they provide safe care, contributing to optimal patient outcomes? So the next thing I have for you there is a little practice question. And that is, if you look at this particular item and see if you think it's of adequate difficulty. You can stop the recording if you'd like. Well, as you look at this question, it is clearly too easy. And that is, it's not going to differentiate at all. Almost 100%, if not 100% of your students are going to get that item correct. And that's because as you look at it, C is the only one that has multiple elements, and also the fact that the stem contains the term chest pain, and the option C has pain in chest. So again, that redundancy in those two places is a big clue that that's the right answer. So the next question is, shouldn't we try to have some really hard items to challenge the top students? And if you really do have questions where, overall you're looking at that 30 to 90% getting them correct, then that's sufficient challenge, certainly for your top students. And if they really are your top students, then they're going to have the top scores because the cream's going to rise to the top. So just a little checklist, and we'll be talking about several of these issues again when we get to the second part of this module. Is the key the only defensible answer? Remember that tests must be legally defensible. Does the stem clearly express the question you're asking? Is the item written at an appropriate level, which means nursing student, right? Not specialty nurse. Are all the distractors plausible without being too close to the truth? And that is, I used the analogy one time when we were talking about discrimination, which I think is a really good analogy, about glucose control. And that is, the tighter your glucose control, the more likely you're going to have hypoglycemia. So, you try to have diabetics who have really nice tight glucose control, but again, you're going to have more hypoglycemia. So keep in mind that when you have distractors that are very plausible, the more plausible they are, the more likely you're not even going to have 30% of the students get that question right. So it is, again, that delicate balance. So you want your distractors plausible without being too close to the truth, because, again, you want the really good students to choose the right answer, and you want to you want the students who really don't know the information to choose one of those very tempting distractors that you provided. And the final question is, do you expect about 30 to 90% of the students to get the item correct? That's what you want. So the goal of testing is to differentiate again between the students who understand the material and can provide safe care to their patients and their future patients, and students who are potentially unsafe because of their lack of knowledge. Do keep in mind too that not everyone should get an A. And again, I think as a student, everybody wants an A. But as a teacher, you have to recognize that you want a test that discriminates between people who know and people who don't know. And, in graduate school, what I strive for on a test is to say that the mean is in the, 85 to 88 range. If you're talking about undergraduates, then you probably want your mean in the 80 to 85 range. You probably don't want your mean at 70. That probably means that, number one, you're accepting students who probably shouldn't be accepted, or your test is too difficult. But typically you're looking at means of around 80 to 85 for undergraduate, and 85 to 90 or 85 to 88, something like that for graduate school. So I hope this is helpful. The next module will continue with avoiding common errors.